How do you even draw a border on water? I mean, it sounds kind of impossible, right? But for nations, these lines on the ocean are a huge deal. We're talking wealth, power, and international law. So today, let's get into how those lines get drawn and, more importantly, what happens when countries just can't agree.
It really all boils down to this one simple but, wow, incredibly complex question. Who actually owns the ocean? Your first thought is probably everyone, right? But the moment you start talking about resources, security, and national territory, well, that answer gets complicated, and it gets complicated fast. So, to even begin figuring out who can claim a piece of the ocean, we've got to understand the main player in this whole drama, the state. What is a state, really, and what gives it the right to claim anything in the first place?
Okay, so under international law, a state is way more than just a shape on a map. Think of it as a sovereign community. That means it's legally in charge of its own turf, totally independent and free from outside control. It's the ultimate authority within its own borders. The buck stops there.
And this whole idea of a state, it's really built on four essential pillars. You need people, a government, and this thing called sovereignty. That's the ultimate power to rule. But for what we're talking about today, we're going to zero in on that very first element, the one that sounds so simple, but believe me, causes a ton of conflict. Territory.
Now, defining territory. It's pretty straightforward when you've got a big, solid landmass. But what happens when your country isn't one piece of land? What if it's scattered all across the sea?
Yeah, think about it. For a country like France, you just trace the coastline. Easy enough. But what about an archipelago, like the Philippines? We're talking about over 7,000 islands. Where do you even begin to draw that border? Does every single tiny island get its own little bubble of water around it? Or is there a better way?
And this is exactly where something called the archipelagic doctrine comes into play. It's a super important legal idea. It basically says that a nation made up of a bunch of islands can be treated as one single unified whole. That means the water between the islands isn't just empty ocean, it's actually part of the country's territory.
So how does that actually work? Well, a normal baseline for a country's border just kind of hugs the coast. But for an archipelago, you get to do something really cool. You basically play connect the dots. You draw straight lines connecting the very outermost points of your outermost islands. And just like that, all the water inside those lines becomes internal waters. It's treated just like a lake inside your country. All right, so you've drawn that big main boundary. What's next? Well, those lines on the water, they create these different zones stretching out into the sea. And each zone has its own set of rules and rights. Starting from that baseline we just drew, a country gets a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Here it has full control, full sovereignty. Go out a bit further, you have the contiguous zone. But the real prize is way out at 200 nautical miles, the exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. This one is huge, because it's all about who gets the right to fish, drill for oil, and tap into all the natural resources in that massive chunk of ocean.
And that right there is why drawing those baselines is so incredibly important. Getting those lines right allows a country like the Philippines to lock down its economic future by giving it control over all the resources, living and non-living, within that huge EEZ. Now, this whole system is governed by a treaty called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. You'll hear it called UN Clause. And it was put to the absolute ultimate test in one of the most heated maritime disputes on the planet, the South China Sea.
So back in 2016, an international court, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, issued a really big ruling. It was for a case the Philippines brought against China over its massive claims in the South China Sea. And let me tell you, this decision was going to have huge implications for the law of the sea everywhere.
And the court's finding? It was crystal clear. It said that China's 9-dash line, this U-shaped line that claimed pretty much the whole South China Sea, had no legal basis. Zero. Why? Because the UNCLOS treaty, which, by the way, both countries signed, it just flat out overrides any so-called historic claims to resources.
But wait, the court didn't just stop there. It had to tackle another critical question. What are all these little specks of land out in the sea? Are they islands? Are they just rocks? Because under international law, that distinction is everything. A real island, one that can sustain human life on its own, gets that huge 200-mile EEZ. A simple rock, it gets nothing.
So, the court literally went through them one by one. Take a look. Scarborough Shoal, Johnson Reef. The court classified them as rocks. That means no EEZ. Then you have others, like Mischief Reef, which were called low tide elevations. That's basically a fancy term for a sandbar that's underwater at high tide. And those, they generate no maritime zones whatsoever.
And the final conclusion, wow, it was a bombshell. The tribunal ruled that none of the features in the entire Spratly Islands group were actual true islands capable of sustaining human life or an economic life of their own. And therefore, and this is the key part, none of them could be used to claim an exclusive economic zone.
This whole case, it really brings us back to a much deeper question. This isn't just about lines on a map anymore. It's about the very nature of sovereignty and how it squares with international law.
You know, sovereignty kind of has two sides to it. There's internal sovereignty. That's a state's supreme power over everything inside its borders. And then there's external sovereignty. That's its independence from other states. The South China Sea case, it's all about that external sovereignty. It's about what happens when states' claims smash into each other.
So, how do you solve these kinds of conflicts? Well, it happens through this really fascinating idea called auto-limitation. It sounds complex, but the idea is simple. It means that a totally sovereign, completely independent state can choose voluntarily to limit its own power.
And that is exactly what's going on when a country signs a treaty like UNCLOS. It's a perfect example of auto-limitation. They're basically saying, you know what? We agree to follow these rules, even if it sometimes restricts what we want to do, because we believe in having a stable, predictable, rules-based world.
And signing on that dotted line has real consequences. UNCLOS itself says right there in the text that any decision from a court like the one we've been talking about, it's final. It has to be complied with by everyone in the dispute. Hey, that's part of the deal they signed up for. So when you take a step back and look at the big picture, you realize this isn't just some far-off legal squabble over rocks and reefs. The real question here is a fundamental one. Are our oceans going to be governed by a shared set of rules that we all agree to, or is it just going to be a case of might makes right, where whoever has the biggest fleet gets to call the shots?
And all of this leaves us with one last really big question. The court has laid down the law. The rules have been clarified. But in a world made up of sovereign states, if a ruling like this is just ignored, who, if anyone, actually has the power to enforce it?